All right. So welcome everyone to our program this evening, Decoding the News. Again, my name is Emily. I'm a reference librarian here at the Watertown Free Public Library. For those of you I haven't met, it's nice to see you and thanks for being here. So tonight we are welcoming David Wallace to our Zoom room. Thank you for being here, David. We are going to be talking about decoding the news. How can you skip the bias, lose the hype, and quiet the noise when it comes to the news you consume? Tonight, David Wallace will teach us to go beyond the headlines and be sure that you're getting accurate facts about the election, the pandemic, and more. Mr. Wallace will show us how to be certain of the details when it matters most. David Wallace is a former business and tech reporter for the New York Times and Reuters and a journalism adjunct lecturer at Boston University. Thank you so much for being here, David. You can take it away.
Okay, thanks for having me. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to encourage people to use the chat, at any point, raise your hand, use a reaction button that's down at the lower toolbar. This is designed to be a workshop. It's not ever been a lecture. There are always either questions or tools that I learn from people in these workshops, as well as finding out what is really, on people's minds. The objective really is to get through some slides very quickly, provide some background, provide some basic training as it, what is news, and give you the opportunity to either ask questions, look at some live websites, ask some questions about your media consumption and news consumption, and we learn from each other. So let's dive right in. I'll get my own face out of the way and share my screen.
And David, I should mention, this is being recorded. So for everyone who is watching, this is being recorded. So don't worry about that. And like David said, I neglected to mention, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box down below. I'll be monitoring that chat for the end of the talk. Thanks so much. Sorry about that, David.
Not a problem. I want to start by asking, especially if you are either new to chat or new to being recorded, there are ways to ask questions in private, or there are ways to raise a hand and get involved in the conversation. It's useful for me to know if there are international visitors or international citizens involved in the workshop, largely because the experience of the US media is very foreign to some people who grew up overseas or who have traveled internationally and aren't quite used to a political season, to the variety of ways that are not normal on the best days, let alone when things are really out of control in the last 30 or 60 days of a very contentious presidential election in the middle of a pandemic. So all of this is new territory, and particularly in places where there is state-run media or a national news outlet like the BBC in England. There are differences in the way that the US news and media landscape may be a little unusual. So feel free to raise a hand or ask a question. We're going to get started with a topic that I know a little bit about, and ideally, it's a way for us to get introduced, at least a little bit. And in the ideal world, we'll just move along. As far as a bio and general background, I've been a contributor to the New York Times, or I've been a contributor to Reuters. I've not been an employee of either of those organizations. The same is true of the Boston University. So definition of the experience may be a little different. But yes, I have been a working journalist, and that's the background that I bring to the conversation mostly. Now, for some of you, one of the benefits of hosting the webinar is I get to talk about myself. So we'll make this mercifully brief, and this will be part of the definition and sort of table setting to get us started, because I'm not any of the famous David Wallaces, not a Hawaiian mystic and faith healer, and none of the other people on, at least on this page. The basic part or start to tonight, the part that I want to make the most important is that you look for proof, that you look for documents or information that confirms news. If there's anybody who has done Googling or done basic searching, you know you can always get lots of information, but you may not get the facts that confirm what you need to know about a particular issue. Another starting point really is that media is a thing. It's like diet or personality. There are good ones and bad ones. There's no issue of right and wrong in terms of facts. The sun is going down and it is getting dark. That's something we can agree on. I think, I hope. It's also happening only here. You know, there are other parts of the planet where the sun is still shining. So keep in mind that what we're talking about, without getting too deep and existential, is facts that are facts, news that is new to you, useful to you, realistically, you know, things that are going to have an impact on your life, and information that is coming from an official source that you trust. That may be official records from your government. It may be a firsthand account. That was the case in a news event like the US Airways flight that landed in the Hudson River, that only the people inside the plane could show you pictures or tell you stories of what it was like to be on that plane. So you may need to check if somebody claims that they were there. You know, is it true? Is it an actual fact that this person was a witness to what happened? Did they really participate, and, you know, can they prove it? Again, to sort of level set, news is somewhat in the eye of the beholder. It's news to you if it's information that affects you. On this slide, we have a couple of different definitions of what you might see on a web news site. Sometimes it's facts and figures. Not all of these articles are, or content pieces, if you want to use the current language. Content isn't always labeled news or analysis or breaking news if it's a new set of facts that have been added since the last time a particular story was told. So you have to constantly be aware of, are you getting new information? Is this data that's changed? Or especially in the case of the pandemic, is this information that is going to require a change in how you react, how you respond, things that you do? So just from a framing vantage point, it's useful to know, as you look at it, what you're seeing is news and information. Is it analysis by somebody who is offering you some kind of an insight or a why or an explanation? Is it an opinion with a that's great or that's terrible or some other kind of view or description of what's happening? These are all kinds of journalism. They're parts of journalism, but they're getting harder and harder to pull apart because you're getting information from lots of different places. You're getting talk show hosts going on and on about a particular topic with what they think is analysis, but it may not be new information. So it may be a news channel, but it's a discussion. It's not reporters doing news all the time. There are some new shows that have come out, like WGN America is claiming that its new evening news nationwide is going to be nothing but news. People at an anchor desk telling news stories from different parts of the US, not discussion, not analysis. So a lot of the things that you're looking for depends on what you're after. Are you looking for new information, or are you looking for the explainer or the analysis? Again, everybody's media diet, everybody's news understanding is different, and we'll get to how do you do that? How do you decide how much of each of these you really want to have in your day? Because you could certainly spend all day doing nothing but looking at this. Down at the bottom here, there are some other long form parts of journalism. There's curated journalism. There are people who do nothing but scour the news sites so that they can write books, so that they can write websites with facts they attribute to other news organizations. They don't do original reporting. All they do is compile and assemble, and that's their contribution to what journalism is. So let's start with that as a baseline. Are there questions so far, or are you understanding what you're seeing as news, analysis, opinion, headlines, as opposed to an explanation? And let's go to our poll. We can continue on from the conversation. I'm going to launch it and ask you to pitch in. We'll give this 2 or 3 minutes of what are your sources of information, because I think that also can determine whether what you're getting is news, whether what you're getting is opinion and explanation, or if it's some sort of a commentary from your friends and family, because that also has some impact on what you're getting and consuming. So we'll give this another minute or so, Emily, and it looks like people are voting early and often, which is good. The reason this is relevant and part of the conversation is a lot more news information is being passed privately. It's being given to you in a way that you can't respond or can't fact check. It's coming in text messages. It's coming on closed networks like 4chan, 8chan, where it's essentially being broadcast, but only to you from somebody. And what that does is it provokes a reaction. It provokes you to have a response, and it's difficult on the fly for you to fact check because all you're seeing is the headline. Think back to the ways that if you were receiving news on a TV, radio, newspaper, website, you can click, you can check other channels and see what the response is. But if all you're seeing is a Facebook post or a text message with a, "Can you believe this?" you're now in the position of having to do your own original research, having to do your own basics as a reporter to confirm what you're seeing, hearing, or being told. I'm going to close out the poll because most of you are talking about news outlets. That's good news. And I think what that also does let's go back to stop sharing the poll, and if we can, Emily, can you close that from the screen, or are you seeing that on the screen?
Yeah. Let me, oops. So I think it wants you to share the results first. Sharing results.
Okay.
And then I exit out. Is it gone now? It's gone on my end.
Okay. So I can still see it, but I'll try and close it.
Yeah, there should be a little X in the corner.
Yep. So I want to go back a couple of slides actually, because I think what's most relevant in our discussion is realistically being able to tell news from not news and being able to identify misinformation or things that are listed as news, shown to you as news, but really potentially not information. They may be sponsored content coming from an advertiser. They may be advertorial. Again, if that's a term that's unfamiliar, it may appear in a news organization website, in a newspaper on a website, but it may be advertorial placed by an advertiser with some news value, with some information that the company or the organization thinks is useful to the audience of that news audience, whether it's age, location, demographic. There are lots of different ways that the news organizations are trying to get more in front of their audiences, get more information, make more money, frankly, because the subscription numbers and dollars from news organizations, TV stations, advertising is down. So there have to be other ways to use the audience or capitalize on the audience. I think that's an area where especially young kids need to figure out, well, I saw it on Wikipedia is not an answer. Where did you see the information? Can you trust that it's reliable? And realistically, do you trust the source? The reason we're going to take a small detour into neuroscience is you need to know when you're being manipulated with information like supplies are limited, order now. We instinctively respond in fear, but there is a part of the brain that humans have in the prefrontal cortex that helps us process information and go from that sort of fear to understanding and use the prefrontal cortex to process the information, come up with a less fearful response. The business part I gave a little bit of detail about, but think about in your news consumption, what is the business model of whatever the source is? A TV station, a newspaper, a radio station? Is it membership driven? Is it advertising driven? Is there some reason that you can think about in terms of spending your money, spending your time, spending your attention span, in terms of what is the business model? What is this information trade-off in terms of, especially on the web, what does the sender of this information want me to do? Do they want me to subscribe? Do they want me to click, to forward, to get angry, and have that sort of response where, oh my, I have to send this to 10 people to get them thinking the way I think. Some of these are questions that you do sort of think through, and it's not a second thought. You go to a website, and unlike in the days of broadcast TV, you might see different things on the website at different times of day. It's going to be changing. Different people with different browsers or different computers see different things, even if they do the same Google search side by side as you do. Mac versus PC. Matt in Illinois will see different ads than I see here in Boston. So there's no such thing as seeing the same news necessarily, unless you're on the same website and seeing the same broadcast at the same time. So that's another of the many things to consider. It's like driving. The more you do this, the more you instinctively check your mirrors, check your speed, think about all of the different ways that you're getting bombarded with information, and you have to make sense of it, organize it, decide in rank order what you think is useful, helpful, inflammatory, etc. Now for the good part, the work that you do in terms of identifying what passes the smell test, what passes your own filter for reliable information, not reliable information. It pays to not consider or not put too much weight, rather, on popularity or advocacy, the kinds of big picture, are they famous, with the number of followers. Just because Kim Kardashian tells you the world is flat doesn't necessarily mean it's so. So you've got to think through, what are the outlets you trust? What are the people you trust to give you information, as opposed to those who are trying to just get a reaction, get a response from you. I won't go through and commit PowerPoint harakiri with the smell test, but it's a good way for identifying, triaging the information that you're getting, being skeptical, not necessarily cynical, but starting with what's missing. It's the last L down here for what's left out. But what is it that you'd like to know that isn't there in the story? Down here at the bottom, there are 2 websites that I recommend, depending on what your normal source of information is, to see how the other side of the argument is presenting a set of facts. Was the pandemic dangerous, or is it not dangerous? It's being presented different ways on Fox News than it is on MSNBC, because one is conservative, one is left-leaning and liberal. That has very little to do with the science of a pandemic, but it does add to the political, the business decision, the other factors in terms of who benefits, what are the business model or business implications of, are people taking this seriously, are they not taking it seriously, and are they doing that based on the science or based on what they're seeing from the news media? Again, you have to decide for your own circumstance what makes sense and is helpful to you, but you then need to put that in the context of my block, my neighborhood, my state. And the advice I give in terms of finding the information is get as close as you can to your central source. So if it's election news, it's your town or your city clerk. It may be your state or your county if that's where you're getting your information on pandemic reports, not necessarily the CDC or Johns Hopkins, because they're looking at the national picture, but what's going to have the most impact on you directly. This seems like a good point to stop and see if there are questions, if there are.
Oh yes, we have questions.
Oh, we have questions.
Yes. I think someone here might also be an information professional is my hunch, but we will. Oh, also someone here is waiting to come in. Okay. So I have quite a few questions. I'm gonna start from the top. So from Matt, what are some of the overlooked elements to consider engaging a media outlet or website's credibility and trustworthiness? Is there something emerging that wasn't necessarily emphasized as you were launching your career?
The good news is all of those are in the last 3 to 4 slides, which will be coming up very soon, almost like I anticipated the question. In my career, it was the amount of information that just keeps increasing and the narrowness of people's willingness to only watch what they want to watch or believe what they want to believe, which is part of the online ability to only watch websites, watch news that you agree with, because there is a degree of information that is only aligning with whatever belief system, meaning, and not just politics. So it's, there may be a weather forecast that is hyper local, and that's all you know and all you care to know. It may be people who are watching sports or entertainment coverage, and there is so much of it that it can crowd out other civic information. So there's a lot of academic research about, especially in the pandemic, isolation. People who are only doing the minimum because they don't have time to get a balanced media diet of information from lots of sources, international, very local. There's a train of thought in my career that is, look at what international news sites are telling you about what's happening in your country, because their view of it is going to be very different. So if you go to BBC, the Canadian Broadcasting, CBC, there's an English language news program from DW, it's German owned. So all of these are different viewpoints on what is happening in the US, whether that's wildfires in the California region, politics. It puts things in perspective in ways that American television does not, because American television is so focused on weather, because everybody has weather, both locally and nationally. And I think it's also very US focused. And the joke of, dark humor in the news business is plane crash kills 400, 3 Americans on board. So the US news is always focused on the impact to only American citizens.
Okay, so I have a follow-up question, which you kind of touched on, also from Matt. In a world where so many news outlets are often seen as left or right on the political spectrum, which outlets are best in terms of balance, fairness, and objectivity? And even asking that question raises the other question of how can we trust that your answer is accurate?
Okay, then it's probably time for me to share the other screen. And I think the best way to get at this is the tools that were on the previous slide for redblue.com and all sides. I think this will help in terms of not just my answer, but also how do you decide for yourself? I'm not going to tell you what you should and shouldn't eat, shouldn't read or view as news. The reason I shared this is All Sides has its definition, which is a work in progress, of news outlets that are left-leaning, center, and it's all about news. It's not about the NPR opinion, which is here in the left. They've done this research on a several years rolling basis, both to define it themselves, but also to get feedback from viewers and readers. What do they think? The reason I made this a live slide is you can see what they've defined as centrist, objective, fact-based. You can tell from this list, most of them are business, well, Reuters, Wall Street Journal is pro-business. If you want to consider the journal a news source with a bias, it's going to be positive to business or pro do more business. The BBC is, is well known as a news source that's trusted to be not political in the US. I don't know how they're viewed in the UK. The other thing that All Sides does is it allows you to decide up here how they rate bias, and then they have a tab here to decide what you think is important. So how do you identify on social issues, on environmental issues, on political or policy matters that are rank choice of, are you deciding on a particular matter? Because again, depending on your view of what's important, if you think schools and school board information is most important, you're not going to get that from the BBC. You're going to have to find a local outlet that gives you the data you need or the information from a point of view that you think is trustworthy.
Awesome. That seems like a very good resource. Thank you for sharing.
And there are others out there. There are sites like News Trust in terms of giving a seal of approval or the blue check on Twitter that tells you that this is coming from an account that's been verified. There are other ways of getting information from a reliable news source, not just, in the way that you can look at a website and see that it is obviously fake. There are spoof sites like the Philadelphia Ledger.com. If there's somebody putting a news site together, you may not know unless you're from Philadelphia that the Ledger is not a legitimate news source. The only papers in Philadelphia are the Daily News and the Inquirer. The Ledger went out of business in the 1960s, but the URL is still available.
Okay. I have a couple more questions. I'm going to combine two of them because they're very similar. Jackie would like to know how social media has changed the way in which reliable and genuinely factual information is spread. To piggyback on that, Matt also wrote in and asked if you've seen The Social Dilemma on Netflix, which is all about the spread of information on social media. So I guess we have several people who would like to know about the impacts of social media on the news.
Yeah, I mean, it's part of the problem of all of us being connected and only being milliseconds apart, that there are lots of different ways that social media and people, rage posting or clicking can share information. And it's a personality habit. It's part of the reptile brain, and the neuroscience slide from earlier is you have to kind of check yourself and say, how does this make me feel? How does this headline make me react? And I want to fact check it before I share it. I want to read the tweet before I retweet it. I want to see that it's coming from a verified source and it's not just InfoWars, which is very extreme, or Democracy Now, which is very extreme, with an interpretation of the same set of facts from two very polar opposite points of view. If you can figure out to sort of identify what the response is, what the objective is of the poster. And in some cases it is from social media of send money. It's from a candidate. So it's sign up on my blog, send me a contribution, put your name on my petition. Always be aware of what the ask is, in addition to doing the fact checking of seeing if the information is legitimate.
Awesome. We have one more question that came in about journalists and social media in particular. Many journalists are expected by their employers to push out stories via social media to grow their followings. What effect has this had on reporters' work product? Do you think that the reality that they will be promoting the story prompts them to write in a more sensationalistic manner?
That's part of a really difficult issue that nobody's really got a good answer to yet. And I don't want to cop out to the question. I'll give you my opinion, which is, yes, it's very difficult for a reporter to have multiple missions with their story. It's one of the things that has tripped up news organizations like the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, the New York Times. I don't think that reporters are trying to write more sensationalistic or get gotcha news if they're from a big news organization, because they don't need that. For those of you, show of hands, who are old enough to remember Matt Drudge, the way that Drudge or independent journalists often did that so that they could get clicks, get following. So again, it's difficult for the reporters or the writers because that's a perception or it's a fear. It's also a difficulty in terms of their balance of, for a reporter who's very deeply involved here, do they have to check all of their interests at the door? Can they not have a favorite sports team? Can they not have a favorite dog or cat? Because they run the risk of alienating cat owners if they come out as pro-dog. There's a lot to try to unpack here in terms of building a personal brand, building a reputation for ethics and accuracy, being willing to interact with your audience and talk back or be transparent in terms of showing the notes, time-stamping the information. The other thing that's happening in journalism, because it's moving so quickly, is a lot of organizations are trying to show their work so that they don't run into this problem, as for example, that Bob Woodward had with his book of, we're working on this, we are doing it in a collaborative way with our audience. If you have information, send us information. Because news organizations know that the longer they hold something, the danger is someone else will come out with that information, or the more people you talk to as a reporter, the more people know that this is happening. So there's a potential for what is known in the business as front running the story, for somebody to try and get ahead and discredit your work long before your piece gets to air, gets to print. You don't want to be fighting as a reporter the basics of the facts of the story while you're doing the work. So it's very complicated because so many people now have instant access to their own audience. It's one of the reasons that InfoWars and Roger Stone on the right, Seth Abramson, Sarah Kendzior, and some of the other authors on the left have, been able to sling arrows back and forth at what is down the center known as mainstream media.
Fascinating. So that was the extent of the questions I had written in.
Okay, the good news is there are only a few more slides to sleep through. And copies of this will be available if you'd like the URLs. So don't go crazy screenshotting or hand scribbling if you have to. A similar point in the Q&A is, especially with social media, the role of photographs. The ways that photographs are used, editable, very easily photoshopped and quickly photoshopped into a meme. Especially for those of you who are parents with teenagers. I know a lot of teenagers who know headlines, but they don't go beyond the headlines. They know because they saw a meme that there's a thing happening. They don't know why it matters. They don't know the facts of the argument or the reasons why it matters, but they know that there was a meme about a particular headline, and so they know that there is information. There again, it's difficult to correct them. It's difficult to interact with them and have a teachable moment saying, no, there's more that you need to know about a Korean missile strike. There's more that you need to know about a particular assassination or, for example, the explosion in Lebanon and what that matters, not just that there was an explosion in Lebanon. It can be difficult in those cases to trace back, but here are some tools that you can use, like a Google image search, to see if a particular image is photoshopped. I'm sorry to say there is no such thing as a hippo crab. Trying to keep it light. But there have been politics-based photos of, is there a crowd size issue? Is there a, does he look or she look healthy issue? There are ways that people respond to photos that they don't necessarily respond to headlines or respond to a news information story where they're going to read all the way from the start to the finish. Is the sharing working?
Right now, it is not.
Okay.
You might want to stop sharing your screen and then reshare it.
Better. So I think that, the issue with things like the tiger squirrel, the hippo crab, is you can tell what's an obvious fake. It can be more difficult to see, again, the context of, if you see a photo that's presented with a crowd, with a image that's supposed to make you feel something or have an opinion, it's worth taking a beat to say, okay, maybe I need to think about where that is being sent from. So hover over the address bar to see what the sender's address is, or do some quick Googling to see where else the image appears. There are some famous pictures of a shark on a highway that always turns up in a rainstorm or during a hurricane. And it's obvious that there's not a shark on the highway, but there we are. So here are some other resources for decoding social news. And I know we started early on news from actual news sources, not necessarily social news or the ways that you're getting information from your social media sources. But it's helpful to have this kind of a resource so that you can look at the URL and see if it's legitimate. You can look at some of the other details of, is a website legitimate? Is it actually, WLS or WBZ for television, or is it a site that isn't giving you, the accurate information? And finally, here are some experts who make their living decoding and trying to get at the issues of disinformation, misinformation. You do see a lot of people. In fact, next week, there's a CIA analyst and the media literacy group from the University of Rhode Island, and possibly Stony Brook, all in the same week, doing webinars. There are different aspects of this that matter to different people. So is it accuracy in the news business? There are quote unquote watchdogs, like accuracy in media is one that you often hear. The issues of whether this is a public policy matter that should be changed with penalties or local law that makes sending information that is false a crime, is something that hasn't really come up with a good answer. We've seen lots of news scams, but nobody prosecuted in a way of, how do you prove the intent of the scam? How do you prove that the news was manipulated in such a way as to have an outcome that is provable? That's a really difficult issue, especially now in politics. There's a lot that's going to get very dodgy. If you haven't read the Barton Gellman article on the possibilities for election challenges, both from the left and the right in the Atlantic, it's a very lengthy article, but it does lay out all of the different ways that legally, policy-wise, election officials have done election operation based on good faith. And we now know good faith is not necessarily in as much quantity as there once was, in terms of what do you believe, what are the facts, and objectively can you claim that you have won or lost. Sort of stepping back to the watchdog issue, there's organizations not on this list. I'm happy to send out URLs if you'd like them, from different interest groups. So different academic sites, USC Annenberg School, Kathleen Jameson, the former dean of the Penn Annenberg Communications Program, the Pew Research Center. There are lots of organizations that are doing different pieces of research, whether that's about accuracy, about social impact, about getting information that is proven, and sort of trust in news and media. All of that is part of the Rubik's Cube that we've been talking about. Down at the bottom of this list are 3 or 4 specific resources for COVID, experts on COVID. We're fortunate in Boston that we've got so many hospitals, so there's a better than average chance that you've had a biotech company or a hospital resource to check on. The newsletter that the Boston Globe created called STAT is all about the business and the science of medical research. In this case, they've done an excellent job of analyzing the information as it gets disclosed about what people are learning about the virus, what information and what studies are current, what is useful from that study information, as in there have been studies about blood type impact on coronavirus, age, weight, other conditions. There are social aspects of this. So it's about access to healthcare, not just the virus and the virus science. So there's a social element of, can you afford the care? Do you live in a place with big university hospitals? That has some bearing on survival rates, care and treatment plans. There's a lot of different elements of this to unpack. So the only other final note that I would give as far as finding experts is it's down to us as news consumers to pick journalists in some ways the way you used to pick favorite baseball players, favorite musicians. They change from team to team, from band to band, but you decide who you're going to follow based on their subject matter expertise and based on, are they doing the work you need at a particular time? 2 examples that I use in discussion. One is Thomas Ricks. During the Afghanistan war, he was a correspondent for the Washington Post. He went out on his own as an independent and now writes about the military, international policy from an armed forces point of view, and he is very excellently well sourced. There are people in the same category in countless different specialties. Cybersecurity, there's Brian Krebs, also in Washington, D.C. On the subject of all things Trump and business, there's David Farenthold at the Washington Post, and an independent named David K. Johnston, who spent years writing about all of Donald Trump's businesses for various news organizations, and he's also an expert in the US tax code. So those are people that I go to as resources when those stories come out because of their subject matter expertise. So in the same way that you might have a favorite pianist, a favorite drummer, and you follow them and their career, it may be time that we do something similar in terms of local and regional and national news experts. In the Boston area, there is Universal Hub about all things Boston, or there's Eater Boston, which is just about the Boston culinary scene. There's no shortage of experts, but again, it's up to you to decide, do you give them your attention span, and do you believe what they're telling you is accurate when they give you information and they call it news? So coming up on the hour mark, Emily, should we make more questions?
Sure. If anyone has any more questions, please put them in the chat box below. I guess I actually had a question for you, David, if that's okay. You've talked a lot about how people there are some people who tend to like to stay in their own informational bubble, right? Like they're going to decide what they want to watch and read. So how wouldn't those people also, would those be the same people that are looking to decode the news as well? Or how would we um, expand, I guess, other people's worldview? I guess the way that you were talking about it makes me think that there are some people who are always going to watch or read the same things, right? So I guess I'm wondering how we can recognize, how I can recognize if I'm doing that, and how to break those patterns, and how we can encourage other people to do the same, if that makes sense.
I think there are a couple of things to unpack. One is I definitely need to upgrade that slide to include psychology and the filter bubble, because there is a phenomenon with the internet of the more you click on cat pictures, the more cat pictures are going to be served to you, and that's why you spend your time there. So I think, let me take the question in two parts. One is your own filter bubble and understanding that you might need sometimes to change your media diet and look at, if you're in a blue state, look at a red state, out of state news outlet. If you're in a different region of the country, take a look at a different political viewpoint. So they're in Boston, we know that the Globe is fairly liberal, the Herald is fairly conservative, but they're both very limited in what they can cover. So there is an element of get lots of different viewpoints. There may be message boards. There may be other sources. I'm more skeptical on the second part of your question of getting other people to engage in a back and forth. There are people who are dogged and determined that their position is the right position, and they like hard seltzer, and that's just how it ought to be. You'll notice I'm not making any political or election connections here. It's very difficult to get people to admit or see their own bias, despite all the articles that we saw in the last several years of how to talk to your relatives at Christmas or Thanksgiving if they don't share your viewpoint on fill in the topic. That's always been the case. And I think that's where you have to give before you get, in terms of being willing to say, hey, tell me more about your point of view. I want to hear your take on it, without judgment, without this sort of reflex to say, I'm right, you're wrong. A lot of people are willing to tell you what they know. They're not willing to tell you what they don't know. And there are resources on the web, I can put some together if it's useful, of how to have a conversation to gently correct misinformation. How to do it in a way that's private or in a chat or back channel, so that it's not seen as an escalation of, I have to convince you that hard seltzer is the right thing to drink, like it's my job, or I need you to vote my way or you can't be my friend. I think that's where the conversation and the question was going. Let me know if there are loose ends that didn't get neatly tied up there.
Another question. You had talked about how sometimes it's difficult for us to check facts on the fly, which is why we need all of this information about literacy and the way that we consume the news. Can you tell us a little bit about how fact checkers operate on news outlets, especially during election season? Is a fact checker on CNN or another more liberal news outlet going to check the same or different facts than news outlets that may be more conservative?
I'm going to have to start with it depends, in the way that magazines and book publishers have a longer time horizon. They have fact-checking departments in some cases that will go through an entire manuscript, and they will try to flag all of the facts, all of the quotes, all of the details that the writer has presented, and objectively verify what was the weather on that day, what was a person wearing, are there photographs, can you prove it? In terms of fact checking on the fly, we saw this in the election in terms of people who saw the same campaign speech repeatedly. So they may not be fact checking using the internet in real time or using an existing fact of the sun rises in the east. Daniel Dale has watched virtually every Trump public speech since the campaign trail in 2016. Katie Tur of MSNBC was similarly at lots of events. So they know in terms of the facts, they've checked it once and they hear it a second or a third or a 15th time, and they're able to say very quickly, here's a piece of information that is not true. So there's some element of people having that sort of knowledge response because they're knowledgeable and they've seen this before, so they can correct the information. In some cases, they do have independent fact checkers or clerks that are helping them in real time and talking into the IFB when they hear something that might be live, but it sounds like an objective fact that needs to be verified.
Okay, that seems to be all of the questions that we had come in. If anyone else has anything, chat now or forever hold your peace. Or rather, I'm sure that you can email Dave. Very nice.
I am findable and gettable.
Yeah. All right. Well, David, do you have anything else to add? Thank you so much. That was really awesome.
Outstanding. I'm glad to be here. I'll stick around a few more minutes if people want to chat, either drop a question in the chat box, or if there are slides that they want to go back to, I know this is being recorded and it will be shared, but if people want any of the other resources that we've talked about, by all means, reach out and let me know, or send a message to Jill and Emily at the library. Thanks to them for making all this happen.
Of course. Matt, if you want to unmute yourself and comment at all, you're more than welcome to.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, Emily, you've been kind at reading some of my questions. Dave, I just was wondering, you're expecting people to read beyond headlines? Is that really necessary?
I'm wildly optimistic that they will do that.
So I'm curious, why should we let facts get in the way of a good story, though? Can you give us any reasons behind?
Not any good reasons. I mean, if you like the cortisol rush or the adrenaline from being angry, then there's no question. Just read headlines, and only read headlines from the opposing team. And then you will be in a state of perpetual crank and yelling back at your television, if not the pigeons in the park. I think this is where, I'm not a lawyer, I don't play one on TV, but the way that people are so conditioned to react and play defense of my way is the right way, it's the only way it's ever worked, and that, hard seltzer argument means I'm not drinking wine or cider or anything ever again, and if you don't like it, you're wrong. As opposed to having a diversity of views is where, okay, the facts may lead us in a different direction once we get more facts. It's only Tuesday, so there may be more in the week in terms of what's going to happen or new facts that come out that change the headline. And I think that's part of the problem, is people are so busy looking at today's headline as a stop or a photograph as opposed to a motion picture, is one of the problems that we run into in thinking for the long term rather than just the short run hit.
Right. Well, you know, one of the things that I remember hearing early on is that journalism is the first draft of history. And I feel like the speed and the constant deadlines, it used to be daily newspapers came out once a day, and they still have a print edition, but now there's so many iterations of a story, and it's that whole tension of speed versus accuracy.
Mm-hmm. And it's only getting speedier and causing the accuracy to be challenged for that reason. So for the benefit of those of you who've hung in there doggedly, thank you, I will confess two things. Matt and I both went to the same journalism school. He is younger and better looking and taller than I am. So he is also in the journalism racket. And admission two is, as somebody who's married to a history expert, who looks at the long view and looks at the different ways that you can unpack history in terms of social, economic, political, racial, sex, male versus female. There are lots of different ways that you can interpret the same set of facts. And if you only take one and you've decided that one is going to be the only lens through which you view a particular set of events, you're going to miss lots of cause and effect, and you're going to miss lots of, oh, I didn't know that that was also happening at the same time, that culturally had an impact on all of the above. So I think that's one of the reasons why it is a first draft of history, but it's also useful to think about how this is different now than it was. And is that not necessarily, is that a good thing or a bad thing, but how is it going to be viewed in the longer run?
I guess there were, for those who are still on with us, there were a couple of documentaries thrown out that are streaming that I will just formally mention. The Social Dilemma is streaming on Netflix. It's about social media in general, but also addresses the news and the spread of information, mis and disinformation. There's another one streaming called After Truth, streaming through HBO, which is about the same thing. It talks about Pizzagate. I'm not sure how many of you know about that, but it's very interesting phenomenon of a fake news story that was actually had very real life consequences. And then there's actually an ongoing streaming show on Hulu called The Circus that I watch with a lot of my friends. It is all about political pundits, and they follow different political campaigns around the country. And they actually start during the Hillary-Trump election cycle and come to the present day. A lot of the pundits comment, and journalists, and even some social media influencers comment on where they get information, how they comment on it, and then where they go on TV to talk about all of it. So it's all very interesting, and I recommend all of those documentaries and TV series if you're looking for more information on social media in particular, since that was a hot button topic tonight in your questions. Okay.
Excellent.
Well, thank you again, David, so much. I really appreciate it. Have you seen The Circus, just out of curiosity?
I've seen pieces of it. I can't say I'm a regular watcher. I do watch Heilemann on some of his other media hits.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for being here. We'll conclude the talk. I'll
Thanks
stay on
again
for
for
another
having
couple
us.
of minutes. Of course. It was nice to meet you, Matt, and David as well.
Likewise.
Everyone's writing
Thank
in
you.
that says, thank you so much. It was awesome. Very informative. Great.